The Crisis in the Liberal International Order, Insights from History, Theory, and Current Events, part three. Now, in this part, again, this is being created for my students as the context because of major bout of freezing rain and ice accretion here in Ottawa, in Canada. Most classes pivoted at my university pivoted to online or to a pre-recorded, just for everyone's safety. And for anyone else who might be watching, hopefully there's some at least small public good value from this, is to talk a bit about the contribution that Martin Wolf has made to this debate. And a little bit more, what's the word, a little bit more focused. It's not this broader international relations debate, liberalism versus realism. But if we look within the liberal order, and look at it even at the level of nation states, it need not even be at the international level, what Martin calls the system of democratic capitalism, essentially the marriage of free market capitalism or market-based economics, whatever word you want to use, and liberal democracy. In other words, democracy embedded in liberal institutions, the rule of law, enforcement of contract, free and fair election, so forth, the usual panoply. And in a superb book that came out in 2022, if I recall correctly, the Crisis in Democratic Capitalism, Martin Wolf lays bare the inherent tensions between these two fundamental principles of the modern liberal world order, both writ large at the level of the global economy and polity, and at the level of individual nation states. And that is the premise or the thesis of his book, is there's an inherent tension between democracy and capitalism, or the free market system. You can use those interchangeably. They're not literally precisely the same, but let's use those words interchangeably for now. And that's because democracy is based on the premise. So let's drill down from capitalism and democracy to even more fundamental, more primitive principles, liberty and equality. The foundation, the philosophical foundation of free market capitalism is individual liberty. Liberty to transact, the liberty to protection of one's property, of one's person in a system of rules. The right, the liberty not to be coerced by the state or by anyone else. Whereas democracy is founded on the premise of equality. We're all equal under the law. We're all equal as voters in a democracy, in a true democracy, one person, one vote. And so you can see, and the philosopher Akil Bilgrami has written and spoken about this at length, that if you look at those fundamental principles, liberty and equality, there's almost a zero-sum tension between them, that increasing one necessarily leads to a decrease of the other. Now, if we go back up to the meta level that Wolf is talking about, we can clearly see that capitalism left to its own devices, so pure laissez-faire capitalism with only what's sometimes called a night watchman state, just a very minimal set of institutions that preserve the rule of law, but, for example, no attempt to redistribute, no necessarily a social welfare program, and so forth, no welfare state, leads to inequality of outcome. So capitalism left to itself will lead to large inequalities of wealth and income. And democracy, if it gets its way, will try to attenuate or counteract some of those inequalities, for example, through taxation, through redistribution, through social welfare programs. And so that would impinge on the liberty for example, of the very wealthy to become even wealthier. And so you can clearly see where Wolff is going, and I don't want to sort of rehearse everything that he says, but you can see that inherent tension. And one can extend his argument, and as Wolff himself does in some recent lectures, to the crisis in the liberal international order writ large. So we can extend the crisis in democratic capitalism, say within the United States or any other particular nation state, to the breakdown or the apparent breakdown of the liberal international order. Now, I just want to make another observation before I close here, which is that we've gotten so used to the rules-based system of the post-World War II era that we assert that free trade is good for everyone or good for every country that participates in it. Again, as we talked about before, that bold assertion glosses over distributional impacts of freer trade, of globalization. There are winners and there are losers, as we've talked about. But also, it assumes, and this is an underlying premise, this is a background assumption that we just take for granted, that the premise of the gains from trade, that trade is mutually gainful, makes the implicit assumption that we live in a world at peace, or that is largely peaceful. So trade is voluntary and not coerced. So the classic statement of the gains from exchange between two individuals, which is sort of a foundation of modern Anglo-American economics, is that any exchange between two individuals must be voluntary, and if such exchange is consummated, it must be mutually gainful, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. So it's almost tautological. We can have a philosophical debate about that, but that's let's pin that for a separate conversation. But in a world, and by extension, voluntary trade between two countries is gainful for both, but again, with the asterisk, there are distributional effects, and which are unless compensated for, will leave losers, even though there's aggregate gain. But in a world that is not peaceful, in some other type of time, in a world that's at war, or on the brink of war, or in an anarchic state, those gains from trade are much more elusive. And if trade is coerced, then we can no longer meaningfully assert that trade is mutually gainful. I mean, if someone comes and puts a gun to your head saying, give me what you have, give me your stuff, and throws you a crumb, is that mutually gainful? Is that the gains from trade? No, certainly not. Because that's involuntary exchange. That's exchange at the point of a gun. So all I'm trying to suggest here as I wrap up is that a lot of our notions coming out of, call it neoclassical economics, of the gains from trade in particular, which is at the very core of the case for globalization, that globalization is a force for mutual gain, that it's a force for peace, it's a force for interdependence. And again, I will just make one little digression here, that the idea that globalization, what we now call globalization, but let's just call it free trade, is good for everyone, that's premised on a world of peace. But it was also argued that it itself causally could be responsible for leading to a more peaceful world. That countries, nations that are intertwined through trade, through investment, through migration, through technology, through culture, couldn't possibly go to war because it would be so destructive to everyone involved. Now, that was exactly the thinking before the First World War. The view was that war is now impossible because the nations of Europe are so intertwined, so interconnected, that war would be devastating for everyone, and no rational person, no rational leader would ever take us down that road. But yet, that's what happened. The assassination of an Austrian Archduke, Franz Ferdinand, by a Serbian terrorist in 1914, triggered a chain reaction that led to the First World War. And as we know, in that, with the Treaty of Versailles, the harsh reparations Germany and Austria had to pay, the hyperinflation, the depression, there were the seeds for the Second World War, which in turn, as we've talked about, laid the groundwork for our post-war liberal world. So I don't really say that I have answers. I can't end with answers, but there's certainly a lot of questions, some of which we've talked about in earlier installments of this video recording. And I will leave you with those questions again. Is the post-war liberal international order now really in a state of rupture, as Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada said in his much discussed and much talked about speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year? Is it in a state of rupture? Or are there cracks and fault lines which can yet be repaired, yet be patched together? Or are we really now back in a world of great power competition? And if we are in such a world, what's the place of economic globalization in that world? Will we continue to have a world in which we have free or relatively free movement of goods, of services, of investment, of people? We haven't talked about migration, but part of the turning away from the liberal order is in most rich countries of the West now, including Canada, the US, most countries in Europe, the sense that migration flows from the developing world have been excessive. And there can be truth to that levels of migration were too large for the welfare state to sustain in places like Canada or in countries in Europe, or that it helped fuel the housing crisis and so forth. These are issues that are in the news. I don't have to remind you of that. But that has spawned, in a sense, a xenophobic backlash that goes beyond mere economic concerns, but a kind of blood and soil nativism that is now quite openly espoused in places where it would have seemed at least impolite to voice such views, even if one held them. So perhaps it's just as well that these ideas will come out of the closet, come out of the dark, and are exposed to sunlight. So these are the questions, just some of the questions. Many more we could add. But I'll just end with my favorite, one of my favorite quotations from Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. The owl of Minerva takes flight as the dusk begins to fall. So are we still at that point before the dusk has fallen? Or are we descending into the night? These are questions that we can think about and discuss. Thank you for watching.